Thanks everybody for your attention, and thanks to this lovely organization for inviting me today. It's been a fascinating set of talks already, and I'm kind of saying that just to set the stage to say that I'm probably coming from a slightly different angle at this point. So to give you a little bit of background on myself, I was working in localization for several years, more than I would care to count. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I've transitioned into user experience. And basically how this happened was an organic process, born out of awareness of all the things that we were doing wrong for the users, and how in the localization stage we were becoming aware of a lot of things that we could fix if we only had a little bit more participation in the design and the product strategy point of view. So that's what triggered me to kind of work upstream and become closer and closer to design, and eventually moving into full-blown user experience research. And localization is still very much at the center of it. And in fact, the title of this talk, I was really undecided between this or just an alternative title, which would be effectively a little bit more polemical. But I hope to make my case properly before the end of the presentation. So working in user experience research means that a lot of the work that me and my team do is basically sitting down with users and talking to them at a validation stage. Now, for those of you that are aware of what user experience is or what it implies, we can get a little bit more into that, but basically it's the whole process of designing the product itself, as well as any other materials that go along with it. So we have interactions with marketing, we have interactions with development, we have interactions, very close interactions with product strategy. And one of the things that brings awareness to the difficulties that international users find with websites in particular is when we do user testing. So when we go into another market and we want to have an easy or quick awareness of what the main issues behind the usability on the website is, and this is the localized website at this point, even before the launch, we have a local agency recruit for us 10 participants that match up to screeners and profiles that the business is using already. And in these kinds of situations, we have, for example, a case which was a very telling anecdote. We were doing a competitive benchmark on user testing, which basically means that we sit people down for an hour and show them not just our website, but we show them our competitors' websites. And obviously, we pick and choose what we want to find out from these sessions. And one of the sessions really struck me as quite significant because one of the users was shown this website, the Yatra travel agency website. And according to what we thought was good UX and good design, it was perfectly all right. I mean, as a travel website, it's more than doing its job properly. But this user was very adamant that he did not trust the website. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what all these things mean. I don't know what this currency means. I don't know what these colors are supposed to symbolize. The whole response was negative. We tested the second user, and the response was just diametrically different. And then we got into the profiles of who these users were. One of the users was British and was used to using things like Expedia, Skyscanner, these kinds of websites, which kind of conditioned them to expect certain things. They go to a website that is primarily done for an Indian audience, and they are lost just with the way that things are structured. So this kind of was the tipping point that prompted me to think about localization as not just the content part of it, but also the implications that it eventually has on design, even upstream. And everybody here that has worked in internationalization knows how difficult it is to make designers listen to you, and how difficult it is to adopt good internationalization practices early on in the project. So that's one of the things that I have tried with my team to raise awareness to, is the fact that when you're designing a website and when you're doing a certain information architecture, which basically is the layout of things, you have to test it and you have to see how people are actually responding to it. Are they thinking through it in an organized manner? And that has all kinds of implications in terms of design. So my intention was not really to pick on Yatra as an example of that. It's just one of those things where the user feedback kind of triggers a response within the business, even with something that we did not do ourselves. And if you think about, for example, the variety of channels and the importance that content is having all over the world, you see that there are quite a few opportunities for localization to explore different avenues that are not just limited to translation or interpreting or proofreading or even transcreation. One of the key things that we in our business are currently exploring, and this is actually a good time for me to introduce my business as well. So I'm working for Travel Republic. Some of you might be aware of it, but we're an online travel agency that is integrated in the Dnata group, which means we basically operate under the same umbrella as Emirates and Emirates Holidays. And we have on our team, our UX research team, we support all of those brands with the research work that we do. We're 5 researchers currently. All of us are international. We speak more than one language, at the very least. And we conduct research internationally in whatever way the business also requires it. So one of the things that our business is currently exploring is how to move into China, which is a tremendously difficult market, as most of you must be aware. It's saturated, it's got very well institutionalized practices. Users have their own favorite apps. WeChat dominates. Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, main 3 companies, they have the market cornered. So how do you move into this kind of market? So one of the things that we've started to do actually is to do cultural research on what the practices and the gaps are when it comes to travel and booking a trip, and what kinds of things Chinese customers would be looking for in a service like ours. And what we found out effectively is that, for example, the importance of memory and the importance that anecdotally everybody knows about the propensity of Chinese tourists to take a lot of photos. That's for a variety of reasons. One of them is that they don't take many holidays. When they go on a holiday, it's very expensive. They can't afford to take too many days off work. So when they do that, it's a way to keep the testament and to share. And this bonding experience is very important. So we conducted the research locally. We interviewed and did a workshop with Chinese travelers in order to kind of ascertain these main things. And what we wanted to find out from that was to build a list of recommendations that would be instrumental in the product strategy. And this plays into the wider concern of our activity, and specifically for UX research and in my team, which is to prove that culture is a part of UX. And culture is obviously determinant for content, which is obviously impacting localization on every level. And so if we think about the role of content, for example, one of the things that we have to be aware of is social media in particular, socially user-generated content. One of the key things about, for example, the way that content gets shared is the little codes, emojis, what are people actually transcribing. I mean, you've probably had situations where you have a piece of content that is full of emojis. How do you translate this into another language and still maintain the same kind of sarcasm or the little nuances? And it's very, very subtle. It's even more critical when it's marketing materials that are bent on these kinds of local subtleties. And that's also playing into the fact that even though culture is one of the key aspects of what we do, at the end of the day, we are all functioning with the same kind of base systems. I'm not going to go too deeply into this. You probably are familiar with the iceberg mind. But really what it comes down to is that culture is one level of it, but then there are deeper structures. And so when we think about we, for example, think about design, we think how different things could be between different cultures, but that's a manifestation of things that are actually quite common regardless of race, regardless of where we live, regardless of influence. Personality, taste, memories, culture, they are the most visible ways that we actually display them, but things like perception, color, the acuity of things, these are all universal systems. Now, color is actually one of the things, for example, that then comes into play when you apply culture to it. You know, red symbolizes many different things. But basically what we wanted to explore with this was the fact that if the brain is constantly classifying information and everything that we see is influencing the way that we develop and we see reality, then one of the things that we wanted to do was to transcend culture as well. So cognitive biases, is anybody familiar with the term? You've heard a couple of. So effectively, cognitive bias is, you can find this quite easily on Wikipedia. A cognitive bias is it's a shortcut that our mind adopts to do something that requires little processing. So for example, one of the things that we like to say is confirmation bias in particular, when we're just looking for information that validates our opinion. So you have an opinion, you go on Google, first result doesn't quite match it, second result, that's exactly what I'm looking for. That proves I'm right. And you have other things, for example, like social proof as well, which is stronger for certain markets than for others. Some cultures might be more individualistic, other cultures might be more collectivistic, depending on what they actually, the relationships look like. But basically, this is about matching the requirements to becoming more than just mere needs or wants. And because we are interacting with product development directly, we're in a privileged position to actually come to the business and say, you're planning on going to Germany, or you're planning on going to China. There's going to be a set of things that you're going to have to take into consideration, like apart from the cultural considerations of geopolitics, sensitive imagery, anything that's to do with, tensions in the region, all that needs to be avoided. But apart from that, for example, we found that Chinese users, for example, respond really well to content that privileges sharing and family and relationships. Whereas we tested the same kind of content in Germany, and the response was more muted. It was more about an individual experience, for instance. And so this is one of the things that we brought to the business, is really the need to know the audience. And it's not enough to just start with English and think, okay, this is the text that we're going to move forward. Now we're going to localize this text, because it's not the appropriate text in some cases, or you're just wasting time because some of it might not be relevant even in terms of just the user experience that they have on the front end, on the page or the app. So how to bring this together? We developed a little model basically to think about content localization separate from design localization. And the local market requirements or research is basically where we do the market research of informing the business what the overall requirements and context of that market is. But the content localization is what you would typically think of: translation, proofreading, a bit of transcreation here and there. Design localization is where we test with the designers things like, for example, just a skeleton of a page, or what people are expecting to find on this page. So even before people are shown a specific design, we actually run a workshop with them, we give them some cards, and we say, this is a header, this is a picture, this is a promotion. How would you organize these cards in a new page that suits you? And then if we do this with 10 users, for example, in China, and 10 users in Germany, 10 users in Brazil, we will have very different responses. Not just individual, but also in terms of what they expect to find, because everybody's expectations on the pages that they use are modeled or conditioned by what they've used in that market before. And so, apart from that, we also work very closely with copywriters. One of the things that we try to have actually is bring in copywriters and translators, if we have availability, into these workshops. They are there as observers. They can watch how things are going, and they can actually ask questions. And we often get the most penetrating questions from translators and linguists and linguists in general. We get not just in terms of why this expression or why didn't they like this, but more akin to that was a little bit offensive in the way that particular thing came across. Ask them if they would be willing to change it somehow into something a little bit more moderated. And this kind of interaction helped us a lot, because even when we're kind of just gathering these requirements, we're already gathering guidelines for the product team to take into account when they actually develop the final copy. So one of the things really that I've tried to develop over the years is this kind of concern really started with my personal interests. So I was interested in design, I was interested in user experience, I was a localization person. So I had these kinds of sensitivities kind of already in there. But then how to get them across, because you're not going to only work in the context of, it's really great if you have a team that is having those concerns in mind, but not everybody thinks that way. Most of the companies, the way that they work are effectively, like Tom mentioned, thinking of localization as end-of-chain processes and very little participation in the product design itself. So one of the key things that I used in order to pitch localization as a player, as a stakeholder in certain projects, was to think of localization not just as in terms of the content or even just the design, but also as a strategic advisor. And when it came to that, it's important to develop the skills as well. So I went to several courses, I developed certain design sensitivities, and I think that training is actually something that is sometimes lacking in the localization industry. Linguists that advise on user interfaces need to have that kind of skill. It doesn't mean that you need to be a designer, but you need to know what exactly you're recommending and why. And so their participation in these kinds of projects is very important. So I took it upon myself to bring along linguists and to bring along subject matter experts to these design tests, exactly to increase their training and to make them aware and make them familiar with the kind of language and what the designers were looking at and how they could communicate using the same language. Because we talk a lot about localization as a company to the world, but even within the company, between teams, you have to sometimes localize the way that you actually are addressing them. And you have to play to what they are interested in, not just what you're trying to pitch. Of course, if the user wins, everybody wins. And the users that are far away are just as important as the ones that are next door. So with that in mind, some of the opportunities around research, and I'll just go very briefly through a couple of case studies as well. So one of the opportunities is definitely research, local research in particular. If you have linguists, subject matter experts, linguistic managers that can even, for example, advise, they've lived in the country or they have contact with that, they can advise. But for example, other things like chatbots, for instance, is one of the channels that at the moment is seeing a lot of growth internationally and can be used as a way to drive localization as well. So it's not just about translating the strings that the chatbot will use, but also the entire tone of the conversation. Because when you work through a chatbot, I'll go through that in a second. When you design a chatbot, it's not just about, it's not just rule-based. It's not just a question and response. Sometimes there are some nuances. As you will know, well, whoever used Alexa or Google Assistant, you will know very well that they have personalities and they make jokes, and these have to be localized as well. All these cultural sensitivities, you have to have some linguistic experience to actually design them. And they only translate across cultures when the person, the designer, actually has that kind of familiarity and that kind of experience. Another thing is machine learning and artificial intelligence. Now, these are kind of buzzwords sometimes, But there are some key applications. One of them is personalization. So whatever you see in terms of adverts, when you go to a website, that's immediately personalized according to your behavior. When you go from one locale to another of the same website, those ads will change, not just because of the companies, but also because they perceive you as a different type of user, because they profile, obviously. I hope I'm not scaring anybody. This is all data that's available. And you can always use ad block or something like that. But ads is just one case study. So obviously in travel, you always have recommendation engines or, go to this particular destination because you've been to a beach holiday before, so this one is associated with that. What we found, for example, in this particular case, it's not just the attitude that changes. So, for example, in Germany, the attitude was much more negative towards these kinds of recommendations than we found in different markets, but also the expectations on how personalized it actually is. So what good is it to me necessarily that somebody else has bought a similar trip? Maybe I'm just not interested in knowing what anybody else buys. And we found, even just testing that there were very different attitudes towards social proof versus something more ideative, something more creative. Like, you've gone on a beach holiday, why don't you go on a skiing holiday next? And this is one of the things that, for example, will also permeate the future Internet of Things, which is not here yet, no matter how much you actually hear about it on the news. Another thing as well is the service and ecosystem thinking. If you will, these are all, you can think of each one of these as areas of study. I personally feel like linguists should be exposed and should learn a little about these areas, because they are going to grow even more. But it's not just about being able to function within that, it's even being aware that localization will be done differently for these different channels. And particularly about the last one, service and ecosystem thinking. So we think a lot about products from a deliverable point of view. It's all about the next delivery, the next batch of translations. It's going to go into the next release, next build. Oh wait, bug, fix bug, release again. There's more bugs, so many more bugs, and it's measure quality. Oh wait, quality has gone down. What happened? Maybe it's the LSP. It's very quantification based, right? So it's all about the next deliverable in a way, and what we've been observing a lot with, especially with social media, is that people don't mind a little bit of deviation as long as they keep coming up with new content. So people can be more forgiving. Like, for example, for the chatbots in particular, how many of you have used a chatbot in any capacity? Quite a few people, right? So if the chatbot doesn't tell you that it's a chatbot, how do you feel? If you start asking questions of the chatbot and the first thing the chatbot says is, I don't understand what you're saying, how do you feel about that? So immediately it's frustration, right? And especially if it doesn't tell you that it's a machine, because if you know that it's a machine, then you're more forgiving. It's like, okay, this thing is dumb. It doesn't know what I'm supposed to be writing here. But if it tries to pass itself off as a person and you're not yet sure whether it is a real person or not, it's like, well, this company is not sure what it's doing. Then it reflects poorly on the entire experience. And so that's one of the things that goes beyond just thinking about the deliverable, is the impact that it has on the user and the impact that it has on the user's perception of the brand itself. So basically, what we've been engaging in a way also to segment and profile the users into something that we could just say, to copywriters, this is the list of recommendations we have for you for this particular profile. So we have, at the moment, 4 different profiles in the business, and we use them across brands. We try to keep them very general. So we talk, for example, for families. We talk about families with small children versus families with older children, for instance. And one of the key differences that we found through research and that we feed back into the content part is families with younger children privilege safety and security more, whereas older children tend to be more about activities and trying something new and trying different things. So the way that, for example, we got marketing to think about families in particular was you can't just immediately generalize and say a family is any family, two adults and one person that is related to one of them. And the way that we've done this is we've done a big study really on about 42 individual interviews from all different backgrounds, all different profiles. We've graded their profile according to 4 dimensions. One is the demographics, which is just like the age, just talking about the education, income level, that kind of thing. Another thing is the behavioral aspect, which is about their preferences, their attitudes, specifically when they actually interact with travel brands. Geographic, where are they based? Because, for example, for travel in particular, one of the key things is if you live a little bit outside of London, let's say, for example, if you live a little bit outside of Northeast London, you're not quite thinking that Heathrow is going to be as convenient as Stansted, which is a much closer airport. Again, the personalization aspect comes into it, and that's one of the things that we wanted to see is convenience, all of this. And technographic, so are they using desktop or mobile? Are they using both? Because one of the key things about the travel industry, as I'm sure that you all know, is that people prefer to book on desktop because the screen is bigger and they have the illusion of security. Although the mobile booking is increasing as well. So for example, for our brand Travel Republic, traffic on mobile is actually higher than on desktop, even though the number of bookings for desktop has remained very stable. So people are looking more on the phone. Phone, more considerations for UX, smaller screen, less content, you have to write less. You have to make the point with less. And when you translate, for example, from English into Arabic, or a more longer language, I feel like I'm picking on Germany today, but for example, German, I guess that everybody who's working in translation has this kind of thing where it works very well in English, you put it in German, and suddenly the paragraph is 2 times bigger. It just goes with it. So all of this matters for UX because the designers cannot think of a design that looks very nice and tidy in English. They translate that into German or any other language and it looks completely different. And the only way to do that is with lots of research and by making the designers aware of that. So for this study in particular, I'll just explain very briefly how we got to this point. So one of the things that we did for these interviews was we used kind of a powered up Fitbit. It's called an Empatica bracelet. Basically, it tracks the vital signs, in particular galvanic skin response, which is how much you're sweating, what you're in sweating, meaning that when your heart rate and when your metabolism rises a little bit, there's more humidity on the skin. So that's one of the way that we sense that from the baseline that you get more nervous or more anxious about something or more excited. And so one of the things that we wanted to do there was to get them we got 6 different nationalities, and we got them to go through the journey of traveling and just monitor their responses as they would go through this kind of process of reliving their trip from start to finish, from start before they have an idea until the very end when they come back. And what you're seeing on the top right is these signals, and we basically just use them as an indicator to see what the peaks were. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this was to say, where in the whole journey are people experiencing more stress, and is this different across nationalities? And it was. So, for example, British luxury bookers experience far less stress than Emirati bookers. And this is on average, what are you seeing there on the right? Sorry about the colors, it doesn't quite carry forward, but each yellow part is basically a key moment in the customer journey. So the first yellow triangle is the inspiration, the second one is the search, third one is the booking, which ranks quite low. Then the pre-trip, then during the airport experience, and then after the airport, during the trip, and then they come back. So you can see already that where they were the most stressed was during the booking. And so what does that tell us in terms of content? One of the things that we have to be aware is, how do we get people to click on that book now button? It is the moment when roughly 90% of them or more just close the tab, because I'm happy with this. And this is holding true across all localized versions of the website. But is there something that we can do in terms of copy? Well, one thing that we saw was that roughly the same type of valleys and peaks were there also for people from the United Arab Emirates. But on general, it was much more extreme. And this is not to generalize about the audience itself, it's just to really map out where are the key pain points and how can we improve on those. And so bringing that back to what we were doing in the business, which is to profile international customers with actual dimensions that content in particular could use. We then started thinking, for example, about dimensions, the friction sensitivity. So for example, if something goes wrong, am I going to get really frustrated, or I'm a little bit more tolerant and just wait to see how this goes? Or the social sensitivity, how much do I listen to others on things? Low, high self-control, impulsiveness, basically, and the influencing sphere, which is basically how much do I want to impact others. And the difference between these two profiles in particular led us to think, okay, we can have different personas per country, but we're going to have a different content strategy per country as well. And this is the whole process. So obviously, working in localization, you know already, content strategy, very important. It is going to be it's going to vary per country. But with this, we could actually talk to content and product and say, so we have actual specific data that proves that these users are different. It's not a preference, it's not an assumption. We have the research data to prove this part. And that basically led us into doing quite a few A/B tests with different copy, both in Arabic and in English, and try different things. And basically what we got from this type of research is simple things like, for example, in terms of presenting more choices versus less choices. So some people like to see 20 choices, some people like to see just 5, keep it simple. We found that there was also a correlation between markets, for example, where more choices, for example, for us, and think about Google in particular and other similar designs, websites are going more and more into the wave of minimalism. Seems to be coming around a little bit, but for a while there it was all that you would hear was minimalism. And that's partly because specifically in travel, people have to make very tough decisions. It could be quite expensive. So the more options they have and the more they're exposed to, the more confusion it might generate. So our recommendation for these markets was smaller copy, more direct, do not present more than 5 options in any particular screen. Whereas, for example, for markets like China and India, which are markets that the business is now going into, quite clearly it was a different type of perception. There was more interest in having more options, have more of a sense of abundance. And so this basically speaks to the fact that in terms of, I think that this video might play with sound. I don't need a sound, but we sometimes think of localization as trying to push for the concern with the business when actually the business needs to be educated up to a point about not localization specifically, but about being concerned about what the brand is doing, starting from a single point, but for all the markets that the brand is interacting with. And when you think, for example, not every brand has this privilege. And different brands, for example, like Apple, they basically market the same product across the board, and then it just becomes about how to sell it. Other propositions like travel need to be tailored for each market. So it's much more difficult in that sense, because we don't have a physical product to sell most of the times. What we have to sell is content and simplicity and interest. And those are going to vary with different markets. And so basically what I'm saying is UX, if you work in an in-house team, UX can help to build that kind of awareness. Having an early participation as early as possible into the overall design process will be beneficial, not just for you, but also for the designers. Prove value just by working very quickly and being very responsive. And also, in terms of skills, being acquainted with different methods and deliverables cannot hurt. So in terms of, for example, localization, what you're seeing in front of you are basically the 5 levels of user experience. I think I will share the deck later. I think it's part of the... Yeah, so at the end in the appendices, there's the full version of this. But basically, this just means that it all starts in strategy and goes down to scope. Structure is how you think about a web page without any kind of the content in it. The skeleton is how it's already kind of having the boxes in there, and then the surface. And a lot of the times, localization just focuses on the surface. It's important to go deeper than that and go as deep as possible into the product workflow. And so, on that point, just some things to keep in mind when talking to UX in particular and product design. Metaphors, for instance, how are things getting across in terms of, and metaphors are not just on the text, not just on the content. For example, a button is a metaphor up to a point. It's actually an affordance, but it's a metaphor in the sense that you're clicking something that is completely artificial, does not exist. It's a metaphor for the real world. And metaphors are different across cultures. So when you look into that a little bit, even just once you look a little bit into how different cultures use, for example, radio buttons, it's massively different, for instance. We see that there's a lot more preference for radio buttons, for instance, in Indian apps versus ours. Whether there's something to it, it's not, and when I say ours, I mean British, just because of this market. Mental models, what people expect. So mental models is a good concept to actually pick up on because it's something that determines how we think. The navigation, interaction, appearance, all of these things matter for localization. And these things are going to matter when localization speaks to UX and design in general. So I don't want to go too far deep into the different opportunities. I spoke about personalization. One of the key things, of course, is that across markets, personalization is also about cultural indexes and cultural dimensions. Case studies like, for example, the way that dating apps are used in different countries makes all the difference. You will find that it gets much more fragmented. For instance, when you go into, for example, Middle East markets or Indian markets, it gets much more about certain communities versus having like just a general pool of people. The chatbots in particular, I mentioned that they are the new kind of channel, but also the other thing as well is it's going to continue growing, not just with voice interaction, but also in terms of assistance and the way that we just interact with things. And by chatbots, I don't mean voice chatbots necessarily. You can just write. And that goes into play the fact that we spend more than 50% of our time anyway texting on our phones. Can vary if you like Netflix and YouTube quite a lot. And service design. And in terms of these kinds of this kind of interaction and these kinds of skills being important for your experience with UX, I'm just going to jump over a couple of things here. So one of the things that we did right off the bat with all of this research was to develop international style guides. And we didn't want to develop them only linguistically. So as I mentioned, the cultural aspects matter a lot. In terms of the user interface, we tried to use the same template, but it's always about, there's going to always be adjustments. So simplicity is the key. You can't specialize for every single market, but you can specialize for the ones that matter the most. And keep it in mind, of course, that if you look for statistics on apps across the world, you will see that roughly the top 10 doesn't really see many differences across different countries. You have some local apps sometimes coming in, but roughly there's always Google, Facebook, and eventually Yahoo in Japan. And so if you go around the world, these are always seen as the most popular apps. So people get used to that. So basically, using dynamic strings was something that really helped us. We wanted to personalize by using different personas, so that helped us quite a bit with, for example, saying which tone we wanted. That was one of the things that we brought to the business. We tried to reuse patterns, and we tried to plan localization more upstream in the UX design process. So we wanted to decrease the development effort. But the good thing is that now, especially web-wise, there are very good frameworks for localization. So it just becomes about how to use them. And that's the work that we've really tried to push forward. Okay, just to conclude then. So what are the key recommendations out of all this? So the deep understanding of the target markets is not just linguistic, but it's also in terms of user habits, especially when it comes to web, app, anything that is related to your industry and your chosen channels. The multidisciplinary team members. I've been fortunate over the years to work in several teams where actually my team members were natively interested in design, or they were people with different hobbies, and they were kind of intellectually curious and really interested in exploring different things, not just focusing on their area of specialization. But even when, regardless of the point of maturity of the localization workflow in your company, if you have this kind of, if you have anybody that's even remotely interested in design or picking up on something like user experience, that's something that needs to be nurtured, because that person can eventually blossom into being a bridge between the different teams and helping to build that awareness. Because designers are looking for feedback. It's just about talking the same language as them. So training is very important, and also getting involved in the user testing and the research part, because that's where you will get into the product owner's perspective as well. And obviously, shared content ownership and design, easier said than done, depends a lot on what your organization does. Obviously, there is this perception that the copywriters own the master copy and then the localizers own whatever else is done with it in other languages. It should be more democratic than that, but that is a time. So nothing that I'm saying here is meant as a quick fix. There are no quick fixes. I mean, to develop anything like this, it took over 18 months. And that was because the team was already kind of asking for it. You go into a more traditional company with, let's say, more traditional mindset or a different attitude, and it will take you even longer than that. So it's about being patient, it's about being persistent, and participating in whatever activities there are with users, because they will provide ultimately the proof that you need to say this works in this market or this doesn't, and this is the way that we can advise on you doing it. And yeah, that's basically it. Oh, by the way, I also wrote a book about all this stuff, which I think was already advertised. It condenses a lot of this stuff, but yeah, I'm happy to take any questions as well.